I just had the privilege of attending the nation's prayer breakfast. And so as I look at the hearing that we held last week, I am committed that we will have not only justice, accountability, but that we will look to prison reform and have restoration. I have the faith that this will happen. I hope this hearing will bring us to that point. The subcommittee will now come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the committee at any time. Good morning again, and welcome to today's oversight hearing of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. I'd like to remind members that we have established an email address and distribution list to circulate exhibits, motions, or other written materials that members might want to offer as part of our hearing today. If you would like to submit materials, please send them to the email address that has been previously distributed to your offices, and we will circulate the materials to members and staff as quickly as we can. I would also ask all members to please mute your microphones when you're not speaking. This will help prevent feedback and other technical issues. You may unmute yourself anytime you seek recognition. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Today's hearing on oversight of the Federal Bureau of Prisons is a follow-up to the hearing the subcommittee held on January 21st, 2022. And it was our commitment to our members that they would have the actual representative at this time of the Federal Bureau of Prisons to be able to hear directly from the leadership and to secure answers. The hearing last week probed the Bureau's implementation of the First Step Act, the impact of COVID-19 on BOP, the Bureau's response to the pandemic, and the implementation and use of compassionate release within the Bureau, among other topics, very crucial topics in the line of justice and accountability. During that hearing, many questions were raised, and many of our members thought it best to speak directly to the director of BOP. Therefore, I'm pleased to have Director Michael Carvajal here today so that we may delve deeply into many issues faced by the Bureau. 2 years into the pandemic, COVID-19 remains the most pressing and impactful issue facing the Bureau of Prisons as the virus continues to wreak havoc among many of the Bureau's facilities. And I'm uncomfortable as to whether or not they have met the challenge and met the task. From the outset, the viruses had exacerbated the increased health risks for people living or working in confined spaces, which is especially true for prison system where social distancing must be balanced with the need to ensure safety and security. We continue to hear horror stories of BOP facilities struggling to contain the virus. For instance, we heard last week from Senator Chris Murphy that approximately 40% of inmates at the Danbury Federal Correctional Institution in Connecticut were in either isolation or quarantine, with only 80 correction officers available for service, which means that every officer on duty is responsible for 3 prison units. We in the Congress must collaborate to ensure that the remnants of the past can be corrected by this administration that has a new approach, new commitment to the reformation of this system. Then on Monday, we learned that Federal Medical Center Carswell, the women's facility in Fort Worth in Texas, my state, has the 4th highest COVID positive numbers of any Bureau facility in the country, with 248 inmates and 46 members who are COVID positive. 8 women have died of COVID-19 at FMC Carswell since the beginning of the pandemic, while 18 inmates have died of COVID at Fort Worth male facility. In the past 2 weeks, the number of COVID-19 positives in the BOP system has fluctuated between 6,000 and 9,000 inmates. In that same 2-week period, 5 more inmates in BOP custody have died of COVID-19, bringing the number of inmates to die of COVID-19 related illnesses to 284. It appears that there are just too many inmates in the Bureau's custody to control, successfully reduce the spread of COVID-19. And it appears that there has been a slow and ineffective utilization of compassionate release, which should be complied with discretion that the Bureau has. The Bureau of Prisons has several mechanisms within the authority to reduce the number of inmates in its custody: compassionate release, the CARES Act, and the First Step Act, modified even by then Attorney General Barr. Although using overly restrictive criteria, BOP released thousands of prisoners under the CARES Act who have reestablished themselves with their families and in their communities, and importantly, have not reoffended. The Bureau and DOJ should be commended for their decision to rescind the previous administration's opinion that would have called many of these individuals back into custody unnecessarily. I think it's important to note that these individuals that had been released were more released on their application for compassionate relief, as opposed to the BOP assessing their prisoners and determining that they could be released, which causes the problems that we have now. However, as the thousands of prisoners continue to test positive for COVID-19 and others die, BOP has failed to effectively utilize its authority to request compassionate release for inmates. I think they're just waiting. Some may die. From January 1st, 2020 to January 30, 2021, during the height of the pandemic, the Bureau of Prisons filed less than 1% of the total compassionate relief motions filed throughout the entire country. In an attempt to respond to this issue and to help alleviate the rise of spreading COVID, we expanded compassionate release and later expanded compassionate release again to allow inmates to file their own motions 30 days after they first made a request with their warden. Notably, as few as 1/4 of the 284 inmates who died in custody of COVID-related illnesses actually filed a motion for compassionate relief, raising questions about the efficacy of the process. One is Jeff. One is left to wonder how justice was served by the process for the 62 inmates who filed for compassionate release themselves or through counsel, and those whose pre-existing medical conditions were cited by the Bureau after they died of COVID-related illness while in custody. Why couldn't there be a response? The Bureau not only grapples with inmate infections and death, but also with staff member infections and death. In the last 2 weeks, the number of COVID-19 positive staff members have ranged from 900 to almost 2,000, and 7 staff members have died of COVID-related illnesses. While staffing shortages have long been a problem for the Bureau of Prisons, has made a bad situation even worse. The statistics do not bode well for the state of operations for Bureau facilities across the country. As staff members become infected or are required to quarantine due to exposure, COVID-19 directly affects the remaining staff's ability to provide safety, security, general, and COVID-related medical services and recidivism reducing programming to inmates. I do want to take this moment as I conclude my remarks to be able to give appreciation to the corrections officers and staff that operate with compassion, hopefully sensitivity, and strength as they work every single day. 98 facilities remain at level 3 of the modified operational levels, which include social distancing in all areas of Bureau facilities. But as of Monday, all federal prisons are under a national lockdown for 2 inmates died during a fight involving multiple inmates of U.S. Penitentiary Beaumont, including those in gangs. Although details are not forthcoming due to the ongoing FBI investigation, this incident raises concern about the safety and security of the facility, particularly in my backyard, Beaumont, which has been compromised by long-standing staffing shortages. The consequences of staffing shortage in BOP have been witnessed time and time again. The death of Jeffrey Epstein was linked in part to the hours of overtime that officers guarding him were required to work, and augmentation which required and employed was not a corrections officer to guard him. I went to that facility. I saw the need, the freezing, cold, and the needs of those employees that were there. They begged for help and did not get it. Epstein's death precipitated the closing of the Metropolitan Corrections Office. Our chairman has worked very hard on this issue. And so I hope as we go forward that we will listen to the issues. We know that some issues are being investigated by the OIG. We understand that the conditions in many of the prisons are not what they should be. We know that the pattern risk assessment tool, which is at the core of the implementation of the First Step Act and other other programs, has not been effectively utilized. We hope to answer that question on the pattern program that indicates that the National Institute of Justice identified errors in pattern version 1 that I understand are being addressed to revise the version of pattern. If inmates are assessed under the current version of the tool were disadvantaged by those errors, they must be reassessed under the new version. Prison is a place of accountability and punishment, but it should also be a place of redemption, restoration, service, and certainly a place that is decent for staff to work at. And so I look forward to this discussion with our director, and I look forward to continuing to try and restore the Federal Prison Bureau in the way that it should perform. Without objection, I will submit into the record the following documents: written testimony submitted by Allison K. Guernsey for the January 21st, 2022 Subcommittee hearing entitled The First Step Act, the Pandemic and Compassionate Relief. What are the next steps for the Federal Bureau of Prison? Letter from Allison K. Gurney dated February 1, 2022, and 2 accompanying attachments. Written statements submitted by Dr. Homer Ventus for the January 21st, 2022 subcommittee hearing. The first step, the pandemic, compassionate relief. What are the next steps for the Federal Bureau of Prisons? I now recognize the distinguished member from Arizona, the ranking member, for his opening statement. Thank you and welcome, Mr. Bates.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I first thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this hearing. And I also thank you for bringing in Director of Prisons, Director Carvajal, because I think that your swift response to many of us who requested that his presence be here. And I appreciate your response to that, Madam Chair. And we're grateful for that. And I welcome Director Carvajal as well. Thank you for your service, sir. We're glad to have you here today. The Federal Bureau of Prisons is tasked with protecting society by confining offenders in the controlled environments of prisons and community-based facilities. BOP's duty is not merely to provide housing, food, and security for federal inmates, but also to help inmates become law-abiding citizens upon release. All Americans have an interest in BOP's mission because the vast majority of federal inmates, well above 90%, will someday be released into our communities, regardless of our efforts to reduce recidivism. BOP's job is not an easy task, and it has only become more complicated due to COVID-19. In response to COVID-19, BOP undertook a number of steps to safeguard the health, safety of inmates, Bureau of Prison staff, and the public. BOP prioritized inmates from home confinement who did not pose a significant risk to the public, restricted the number of visitors, and limited the movement of inmates among detention facilities. These are reasonable measures, but my colleagues on the other side of the aisle want to go even further. They've tried to use COVID-19 as a reason to let more convicted criminals back onto our streets. They even wrote Attorney General William Barr urging him to, quote, use every tool at his disposal to release as many prisoners as possible, close quote. They even passed legislation in the House that would pay states to release inmates in state prisons and local jails. Think about that. My colleagues across the aisle want to use our tax dollars to incentivize states to put more convicted criminals on the streets earlier. The consequence of these actions have deadly real-world results, as we have unfortunately seen. In March of 2021, Eric Reinbold was released from BOP custody after being granted compassionate release based on COVID vulnerability. By July, just 4 months later, Reinbold was accused and charged with murdering his wife. And just a few weeks ago in Oregon, Clifford Updegrove was charged with first-degree robbery, first-degree theft, and felony fleeing and unlawful use of a weapon. Updegrove had been granted compassionate release for COVID-related reasons the previous year. In spite of these and numerous other crimes that have been committed by inmates released early, my colleagues across the aisle are calling for more inmates to be released regardless of their crime or prison sentence. Democrats on this committee want to open the jails and defund the police. They're turning a public health crisis into a public safety crisis as well. I tell you, Director Carvajal, to please pass on our appreciation to your officers and employees. They have a tough job, and I want them to know they have our support. To that end, I understand that many BOP officers have voiced concern over the Biden vaccine mandate. I strongly oppose any efforts to mandate COVID-19 vaccines and have introduced legislation to prevent federal agencies from imposing COVID-19 vaccine mandates. I look forward to hearings from Director Carvajal today. And I also request that, Madam Chair, that we soon have the DC Director of the U.S. Marshal's Office in for a hearing as well. I think some of the evidence that came out of last week's hearing would do well for both sides of the aisle to hear from the Marshal's Office. And I appreciate you again bringing in Director Carvajal. It's good to have him here. And I thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the ranking member for his statement. I acknowledge at this time the service of our chairman, Mr. Nadler, and the service of our ranking member, Mr. Jordan, and thank them for their leadership of this committee. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's witnesses or witness, and that is Michael Carvajal. who is the director of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. He began his career with the Bureau of Prisons in 1992 as a correctional officer at the Federal Correctional Institute, Three Rivers, Texas. He is, in essence, a committed, dedicated servant to the Federal Bureau of Prisons. He served in position of leadership in Texas, Kansas, Louisiana, before becoming the regional director of Northeast Region in 2016. Mr. Carvajal became the assistant director for the Correctional Programs Division in 2018 and held that position until he was appointed director in 2020 in the last administration. Let me again take note of his service and as well the many corrections officers that I've had and staff the privilege of meeting throughout the system. As I indicated, our task here is to provide a reform and restoration and continued improvement on the institution of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. We welcome you, Mr. Carvajal, Director Carvajal, and we thank you for your participation. I'll begin by swearing in our witness. I ask our witness to turn on your audio and make sure that I can see your face and raise your right hand while I administer the oath. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. Let the record show the witness answered in the affirmative. Thank you. Please note that your written statement will be entered into the record in its entirety. Accordingly, I ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. To help you stay within the time frame, there is a timing light on your screen. When the light switches from green to yellow, you have 1 minute to conclude your testimony. When the light turns red, it signals that your 5 minutes have expired. I now recognize Director Carvajal for 5 minutes. Thank you. You're recognized.
Thank you. And good morning, Chairwoman Jackson Lee and Ranking Member Biggs, other distinguished members of the committee. It's my honor to speak today on behalf of the 37,000 Bureau of Prisons correction professionals who work day in and day out to support our critical law enforcement mission. The Bureau's work is incredibly challenging and it has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 virus. Our management of the pandemic has been highly scrutinized, despite the fact that we have worked in lockstep with the CDC in shaping the guidance for the benefit of everyone who works in a correctional environment. The Bureau was one of the first federal agencies to offer COVID testing and vaccinations. And in January 2021, the CDC recognized the Bureau for leading all jurisdictions and federal entities in its rate of vaccination utilization. Approximately 80% of our staff and 70% of our inmates have been fully vaccinated, and we continue to increase those rates. After issuance of the CARES Act, the Bureau began screening and transferring vulnerable and eligible inmates to residential reentry centers and home confinement. The Bureau has transferred more than 37,000 inmates to community custody, with more than 9,000 of those transferred pursuant to the CARES Act. After review of medically vulnerable inmates for potential placement in home confinement continues based on assessments and the balance with our law enforcement mission. Another common criticism is that we are understaffed. The narrative is routinely misrepresented without reference to factual data. We have approximately 1,100 correctional officer vacancies. However, 7 institutions out of the 121 make up almost 40% of these vacancies. Increasing and maintaining our staffing levels within appropriated funding levels remains our priority. Last calendar year, we hired over 3,000 staff, and at one point, Advance hired 1,000 staff above our funding levels. We have proven that we can hire employees, and although hiring is not an issue at the majority of our locations, we are routinely outbid by competing state and local corrections or law enforcement agencies who pay a higher wage. Accordingly, we continue to work with the department to consider the use of additional incentives so that we may be more competitive. Another area of misguided criticism is the implementation of the First Step Act. The Bureau worked with the department on the development of the Risk and Needs Assessment System and supported the National Institute of Justice, who developed the approved risk assessment tool called Pattern. Staff were trained on the First Step Act, including the new Pattern tool, and we worked with the union to negotiate policies to support implementation of the law. We recomputed the sentences of over 150,000 inmates to ensure that they received good conduct time under the new law. We're delivering more than 80 different programs based on individual inmate assessments. We hired additional staff to expand our reentry programs, and we initiated additional activities to support inmates who have mental health issues, disabilities, or other special needs. We've expanded programming for female inmates, drug treatment, and vocational training. Over 75,000 inmates participated in First Step Act programs by the end of 2021, in spite of the constraints caused by the pandemic. We are modernizing the inmate education platform to include the use of tablets for better program accessibility, and we've created an online system to directly connect the community volunteers to BOP facilities. Additionally, we're exploring ways to provide inmates with ID cards compatible with state requirements under the Real ID Act. We engaged external experts to evaluate our inmate programs, and we're working with NIJ to engage academic consultants to review our risk and needs assessment system. We're also developing a stronger data analytics platform to enhance monitoring and evaluations of our programs and our spending. The BOP worked in concert with the department to finalize the rule regarding First Step Act time credits. We applied the rule retroactively and immediately released almost 4,000 inmates from home confinement and RRCs. We are releasing approximately 1,600 inmates from BOP facilities and transferring nearly 2,500 inmates into pre-release custody. In sum, over 8,000 inmates have had their time credits applied towards pre-release custody or supervised release. The Bureau supports and has always been committed to the implementation of the First Step Act, and we are statutorily compliant. Last year, the Governmental Accountability Office reported highlighted areas where the Bureau needed to improve, and in response, I established a task force to address these identified areas. As a result of the task force's work, 8 of the priority recommendations identified are now closed. Our work in this area continues. Chairwoman Jackson Lee, Ranking Member Biggs, and other distinguished members of the committee, this concludes my statement.
Madam Chair, I think you are still on mute.
That's because my very delicate fingers, I press it and it doesn't seem to want to open up. So let me try to hit it real hard. Let me do something a little different, if I might. And I'm not sure, is Ms. Bass here on?
Yes, I'm here.
Ms. Bass, I'm going to yield to you for beginning at this time, and I'll follow. Thank you so very much. Ms. Bass is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Good morning, Director Carvajal. I'm glad to have you here before the committee today. And I'm sure you are aware that 2 weeks ago, the subcommittee held a hearing on matters pertaining to the Bureau of Prisons, the First Step Act, and the COVID epidemic. I was glad to hear from several experts on these topics, but I'm afraid I'm still left with a few questions that I believe you might be the one to answer. And let me just take a minute to thank you for your service to BOP, and then also to acknowledge your quick responsiveness on several occasions when I reached out with particular specific situations. One of the ways the CARES Act attempted to address the COVID epidemic within our prison system was by providing the BOP with additional authority to grant compassionate release for incarcerated persons who met a number of criteria to demonstrate a low risk of reoffense, as opposed to the way it was described a few minutes ago, Democrats asking for the prison doors to just be opened up indiscriminately. Can you tell me how many people within the BOP have been granted early release under this program? And I wanted to know, for those people that were granted, how many reoffended? I know there have been individual cases, but I want to know if you have any numbers overall or percentages of how many people were reincarcerated due to a technical violation, such as missing a curfew or a phone call, or how many people were released and are unaccounted for, how many people offended again with violent crimes.
Okay, thank you, Congresswoman Bass, and I appreciate the opportunity to make some distinctions here. I think that there is often confusion. I'm going to try to clarify what is going on here. First off, as I stated in my opening remarks, we released or transferred over 37,000 under the CARES Act to home confinement and community placement. Compassionate release is a separate entity. The BOP does not hold the authority to independently release someone from our custody. Under the statute and our current policy, we make a recommendation to the court. The court makes the final decision, not the Bureau of Prisons. The Bureau of Prisons doesn't take a position on the motion in and of itself. And as you stated, there is criteria. We use our policy criteria to evaluate and ensure that each individual case is compelling and extraordinary and compelling circumstances, that they're fully considered. These are individualized cases. We also take into account public safety and victim impact, but I stress that we do not independently do that, and the court makes the final decision. We do not track data. I don't have it in front of me for compassionate release, because when the inmate receives a reduction in sentence, they're no longer in our custody. I can answer the other part of your question. Of the 37,000 that we transferred to home confinement in the community, approximately 9,000 of those were specific to the CARES Act. 320, approximately 320 that I'm aware of have committed violations, have been brought back to secure custody. 8 of those were new crimes that I'm aware of. One was a serious crime. I don't have the details in front of me, but I'm sure we could get them for you.
So you said again, 320, could you repeat that again?
Yes, 320 of the inmates under CARES Act home confinement have reoffended and been brought back to secure custody.
And so you don't know of those 320, how many were technical violations that brought them back? You said 8 committed new crimes. Could I assume that the rest were technicals or not?
Yeah, I can clarify that. I appreciate that, Congresswoman Bass. Most of the most common offense, about 160 of those 320 were for abuse of alcohol or drugs. Some of them were escapes. They weren't where they were supposed to be. Most of them were violations of that nature. Some was misconduct. 8 of those were new crimes committed. The rest were technical violations.
And can you talk about, in my remaining seconds, vaccine distribution, one among staff? How many staff have been vaccinated, and also inmates?
Sure. Our staff, we have approximately 80% of our staff, which is about 30,000 staff that are fully vaccinated. We have about 95,000 inmates, 93 to 95,000 inmates. It's a moving target, changes constantly. That's about 70% of our population. We continue to offer the vaccine and the booster to all inmates. And of course, people can change their mind at any time. If they choose to come back and get it, we make the vaccine available.
And for the 20% of the staff that are not vaccinated, what protocols do you have in place? Do they have to get tested weekly, or what's in place?
Yes, prior to the mandate, we were offering weekly testing. It was voluntary. Obviously, when the mandate came out, we mandated weekly testing for unvaccinated. There was a preliminary injunction issued in January by a judge. We're observing that. We ceased enforcement of the vaccine mandate and all processes with it, but we continue to encourage staff and inmates to become vaccinated. And as I studied, that's a moving target, but we average about 80% staff, 70% inmates.
Thank you. My time has expired.
Fingers are now working, Ranking Member Biggs, and it is my pleasure to yield to you your 5 minutes for your questioning of the director. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Director Carvajal, again, thanks for being here today. A federal court issued an injunction to block implementation of President Biden's vaccine mandate for federal employees. Were any BOP employees fired for not receiving the vaccine prior to the injunction being issued?
Congressman, I don't have the exact numbers off my head, but we can certainly follow up and get that information back to you.
So Director, are you saying that yes, you believe some were fired, but you don't have the exact number?
I do believe some were, Congressman, but I do not have that information in front of me, and I can certainly get it back to you.
Thank you. And do you know if those employees will be rehired?
Congressman, again, I'll consult with my human resource directors. There's processes, so we're observing the processes, and they do have due process, so we can get back to you with that exact information.
Thank you very much. Other federal agencies are creating databases to track employees who request religious exemptions to President Biden's vaccine mandate for federal employees. Has the BOP created a database to track religious exemption requests?
Again, Congressman, with the mandate, we were exploring and reviewing and approving as necessary religious and medical exemptions. We have ceased that process because of the preliminary injunction, and we're following the guidance given to us.
Okay, so I just want to make sure I understand this. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just want to make sure I understand this. So you were constructing a database and you're not now? Is that what I understood? That's what I understood. So.
Yes, Congressman. We obviously track it. We have a process to keep track of the information. So yes, there is a database along with everything else we do. It's tracked for accountability purposes so that we know what status is and things of that nature. We've since ceased enforcement of that.
Okay. I appreciate Ms. Bass's line of questioning because I have a lot of the similar type questions. So in my opening statement, I mentioned a couple of examples of individuals released from BOP custody because of COVID-19 and they committed serious crimes afterwards. Is BOP tracking recidivism rates to see if individuals who have been released because of COVID-19 have committed crimes after their release?
Congressman, the recidivism data that we use, our recidivism rate for the Bureau of Prisons is 43%. The states actually own the recidivism data. We work with them. I don't know that enough time has elapsed since the passage of the CARES Act, but I would have to ask specific questions about that. But again, there is a difference between someone we release and tracking them and someone who's still in our custody and home confinement.
So I understand that the court makes the final determination on a compassionate release petition. And are you tracking those who had been released on compassionate release at all for recidivism rates?
Congressman, I don't want to misspeak. Again, when we release someone from our custody, we do not, the Bureau of Prisons does not track them. They're released from our custody. They're returning citizens. The state, again, owns the recidivism data. We work with them and other entities to get that, but I can have my staff get back with you. I'm not, obviously don't know the exact procedures, but we can get that information for you.
So, okay, I appreciate that. And I wish you would, and reach out to my staff. But in particular, for instance, I want to make sure I understand this. So in Arizona, if someone is given a compassionate release, you guys don't track it, but the Arizona law enforcement, Department of Corrections, maybe Department of Public Safety, somebody's tracking it and gives you data. Is that your understanding?
Yes, Congressman, it's a collaboration of us working with the state and other law enforcement entities. There's a lot of moving parts there, again, way above my head, but yes, that data is obviously being tracked.
Yeah, and I guess I've been asking about compassionate release, and I assume the First Step Act, same thing on the recidivism issue.
Yes, obviously there's interest in our First Step Act data, and we're working with NIJ and outside consultants to review data, things like that. We're working on a platform. I know one of the criticisms early on is that we didn't have that data. Again, there's a lot of moving parts. It isn't because we don't want to track it. There's a lot of entities here. We have to collaborate with other local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies to appropriately do that.
Well, Director, I hope that we can get that information sooner rather than later, and whatever we can do to help facilitate that, please let me know, and I'll have my office reach out to you, and if you'd have yours reach out to mine. I think this information is critical because I think everybody wants to understand that. Thanks again for being here. Madam Chair, my time has expired. I yield back.
I thank the chairman, the ranking member, very much, and I will now yield myself the customary 5 minutes. My time is short, Mr. Carvajal, and Carvajal, thank you so very much, and so I appreciate your respect of that. Following the deaths of 2 inmates in the U.S. Penitentiary in Beaumont, Texas on Monday, all BOP facilities have had a lockdown. Can you explain the decision to institute the lockdown, the national lockdown, and how long inmates confined to their cells during the 24-hour period? If you can just give a brief answer on that, we'll take a longer one in writing. Director?
Yes, Congresswoman, a decision to lock down the entire agency is a serious one. We did it because we felt we needed to find out what's going on. I won't get into specific operational things, but the groups involved, there's approximately 2,500 in our custody spread throughout the agency. We need to make sure that we separate them and secure them. I'm hoping that the lockdown will be short-lived. We do not like keeping inmates, again, in their cells. and we will do our best to get them out as quickly, but keeping safety of everyone in mind.
Thank you. If you would give this committee an update on the moment that the lockdown stops, we would appreciate it for all of the members. Following up, Beaumont Low in Texas, a low security facility, currently has 10 infected inmates, 942 inmates who have recovered from COVID. That seems very high. Out of 1,974 total inmates, including the camp and the correctional institution, which includes low offense individuals. That is almost half of the inmate population that has been infected with COVID-19. 20 staff are COVID positive right now, and 40 have recovered. How many inmates were placed into home confinement from FCI Beaumont Low? How many inmates were released under compassionate relief from FCI Beaumont Low? Are older inmates at low security facilities such as FCI Beaumont Low given priority to be assessed for release under the CARES Act, Compassionate Relief, or First Step Act? If so, what age inmates are given priority? If not by age, are any inmates at FCI Beaumont Low given priority to be assessed for release? You can answer the last question first, please.
Hey,
Director?
Yes, Congresswoman, I don't have the exact data for every specific institution at Beaumont Low. We can certainly get you that data. I know we have it. I just don't have it.
Thank you. Do you use the CARES Act? Is that ongoing to be utilized to date, since it is still operable in law? Do you use that?
Absolutely. We continue to screen inmates for appropriate placement on CARES Act.
And under the CARES Act, with your discretion, individuals do not have to meet the 50% time of their sentence. Is that correct?
That is one of the criteria, along with others. There's only 4 hard criteria.
But it's correct that they do not have to meet a 50% incarceration rate of their sentence.
In instances like that, we do have the discretion. There usually is a higher level review. If the staff at the institution feel that it is appropriate outside of the CARES Act, we have procedures in place to review cases such as that.
Yes, but you have that authority. Mr. Manafort and Mr. Cohen, to your knowledge, did not have 50% of their sentence. Is that correct?
I'm not going to talk about individual specific cases, Congresswoman, but we have procedures in place. We have a committee that reviews them, and I can certainly go through that process if you'd like.
Thank you. I would appreciate it if you could provide us in writing, if you're not going to discuss it, on the individuals released under the 50% rule. Let me ask you, what are you doing to prevent more COVID-19 deaths in the BOP facilities?
Congresswoman, we have been in lockstep with the CDC and other entities from day one. We're doing the same thing that everyone else in the country and the world is doing. We're learning from and learning how to mitigate this virus. As stated earlier, that it's hard to social distance inside a prison. We've learned from that. That's why we appreciate the ability under CARES Act to transfer people out, because we were able to lower our population in those low security facilities as the one you described, who it's harder to maintain. We're following CDC guidance. We do everything in collaboration with them. And frankly, our pandemic plan actually assisted in writing the correctional guidance for the pandemic.
Thank you, Director. And I'll get the rest in writing. Thank you very much. Are you aware of the racially disparate impact of the pattern risk assessment tool, and that inmates of color may be more likely to be scored as high risk than white? And with this in mind, have you considered revising the threshold cutoff between risk categories, which would enable more individuals to earn credits for an early release and maximize the benefits of the First Step Act and take away the racial disparity that we see very clearly? Director?
As Congresswoman, I want to stress one thing. The pattern tool, the BOP did not develop. It's developed by NIJ and approved by the Attorney General. We are aware of changes. We appropriately make those adjustments and rescore inmates anytime there's a change, and we work with the department to do that. We are the end user of that tool. We did not create it.
Finally, do you think it would help inmates on the compassionate relief if BOP filed the motions rather than the inmates?
Congresswoman, as I stated earlier, we don't have the authority to independently release someone. We work with the Department of Justice, and we make recommendations to the court. The judiciary makes the final decision, and we do make staff available to gather documents. We work with the attorneys, we work with the public defenders, and the courts to ensure that all the documents are available so that we can go. It's just not a quick process. That's what people need to understand. The compassionate release process is a difficult one, and it has to be done individually. Each individual case has to be fully considered under its unique circumstances. It's not a fast process.
Thank you. My time has expired. Thank you very much. We will pursue that with you. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Shabbat.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank you, Director Carvajal, for being here with the committee today. Before coming to Congress over a quarter century ago now, I served as a local elected official on Cincinnati City Council and on the County Commission, Hamilton County, Ohio. And in those two capacities, I was very involved with our incarceration at the local level. Things like double celling inmates to help with the overcrowding situation that we had, and then work release programs where we got inmates out picking up trash on the highways, cutting down weeds, 2-for-1 type programs, and those types of things. So when I got here to Congress and then onto this committee, the Judiciary Committee, I wanted to continue in that effort. And one of the closest things was prison industries, or now Unicor, which I wanted to discuss here in a second. But I also got involved and worked with, for example, former Representative Rob Portman, who is now United States Senator, and he was one of the principal moving forces for the Second Chance Act, which we worked with him on, and then the First Step Act, which we passed some time ago. And I worked with Adam Schiff, in a bipartisan manner on the Justice Reinvestment Initiative to make sure that members, we've sent out letters over the years urging members to support funding for that particular program. And so before I ask you about Unicor or prison industries, I just wanted to say that most of the inmates we have at the federal level, this is certainly the case at the local level as well, these inmates, whereas most of them, for the most part, do need to be removed from society because they've committed a crime, and yes, punishment is involved. But the fact is, the vast majority of these folks are going to be out on our streets someday. And so we're a lot better off as a society if we recognize that, and if possible, reform some of them and get them job skills that they can actually work in the private sector someday to keep them from coming back. Now, it doesn't work perfectly, but it can work, and I strongly support those, and will continue to do that. But back to prison industries, which then transformed into Unicor. This is the program that we have where the prisoners at the federal level actually are in work programs. So they're learning a skill that they will hopefully be able to carry over to the private sector, and which should help recidivism rates. So people don't, which means that people don't come back to prison. And the recidivism rates are far too high, as we know. People do tend to come back. But this is one where the rates tend over time to be better when you actually get these people a skill. And they're oftentimes, we might think of the stereotype of people are making license plates or something, but it could be furniture, it could be a whole range of things. So I'd just like to give you a little time here, if you could tell us how that program's going, what your experience has been, how has it affected recidivism rates? Is it a positive thing? Those types of things, Mr. Director.
Yes, thank you, Congressman. Unicor absolutely is a benefit to the agency. It was established by Congress in 1934. The sole mission of Unicor is to train and employ inmates for exactly what you said, to give them a skill to return productive members of society. The last recidivism review they did on Unicor, which is several years old, 24% inmates that work for federal prison industries were less likely to recidivate. 16% of them were more likely to be gainfully employed upon release. So it is a good program. We like to say it's one of our number one, if not the number one, evidence-based program, because it teaches the skills you spoke of. You are correct. Approximately 95% of people in our custody are going to return to society. So it's important to do that. We have a board of directors. They take their statutory responsibilities very seriously. They do minimize the impact to any given industry. Certainly we do that through public comment, board hearings, things of that nature. For those that think that we are taking from local industry, there's procedures in place to stay compliant with that.
Thank you very much. And I don't have a lot of time left, so just let me ask one other thing. I know that it's one of the greatest challenges that you all have when inmates are there. They're criminals, so they got there because they committed a crime. and they can prey on each other, or they can make it very dangerous for the guards. So a program like Prison Industries, is that also a mechanism for, a tool for maintaining kind of good behavior and making sure that it is a less dangerous environment than it otherwise might be?
Absolutely, Congressman. One of the biggest things that we battle that in a prison is idle minds. So anything we can do to keep people productive and learning a trade or a skill is our goal.
Thank you very much. I think my time's expired, Madam Chair, so I yield back.
Since time has expired, and let me for a moment thank the members who are here today. I will yield to Ms. Dimmons in a moment, but I want to acknowledge Congresswoman Dean, Congresswoman Scanlon, Congressman Cicilline, Congressman Liu, Congressman Cohen, Congressman Biggs, Congressman Shabbat, Congressman Stubbe, Congressman Tiffany, Congresswoman Massey, Congresswoman Sparks, Congressman Fitzgerald, and Congressman Owens. Thank you for your presence here today. My pleasure now to yield 5 minutes to the gentlelady from Florida. You are now recognized, Ms. Dimmings. Thank you so very much for your service.
Well, good morning, and thank you so much, Madam Chairwoman. Thank you for the exceptional work that you are doing in this particular area. Director Carvajal, it's great to see you, and thank you for joining us. I just want to, first of all, just make it quite clear that we all understand that there are some people who need to be locked up. But we also understand that many of them will integrate back into society, and it is incumbent upon us to make sure that they have the training, tools, techniques that they need to be successful. We all understand that. Director, you spoke a little bit about Unicor and how successful it has been. Could you just talk a little bit more about that program and how we can even improve upon the success of that program? How can Congress be a better partner in helping those that will be coming back into society?
Yes, I appreciate that, Congresswoman. I think speaking about it and being able to support the program in and of itself, oftentimes we're criticized that we are taking jobs from the local communities. As I stated earlier, we have a board of directors who oversees that. It is a great program. The more that we can keep inmates, teaching them the trades and working. The other thing that I think that hits home is that we're teaching them the soft skills of reentry. Some of these folks have never had an actual job in a factory and punch a clock, so to speak. And they also are earning a decent living for being incarcerated. Part of that is paying their financial responsibility. A lot of them are able to help support their families. Again, teaching that soft skill, which is 50% of our mission, reentry. I have to stress that we want the same thing. We want people to go back to society as productive members of society, and we're committed to doing that. Half of our mission is keeping people safe and secure. The other half, which we're equally committed to, is making sure that they get the skills to go back and be productive members of the community.
Director, thank you for that. You also talked about in your opening statement some of the challenges that you have in terms of meeting staffing requirements, that you're being outbidded by other state and local organizations. Or agencies. I'm certainly sensitive to that. Could you talk a little bit more about, increased salaries is probably the answer, but could you talk about some of the other maybe creative ways that you are looking to not only recruit COs, but to retain them?
Yes, thank you, Congresswoman. Very, very much a priority for us. It always has been. Again, I stated earlier that there's a narrative out there that we can't hire. That's not true. We proved we can hire. We have several locations that are chronically difficult to staff. In those cases, as you stated, we have a hard time competing with local industry or other correctional agencies. We don't set the pay bands for that. OPM does that. We are working with the department on other types of incentives. We use recruitment and retention incentives. We use relocation incentives. All of those are things that we work with to get approval from the department and support going to OPM to be able to look at these areas. Some of the hard to staff places, as Congresswoman stated earlier, Beaumont is in the rest of US pay scale. It's really hard to compete with local industry there when they frankly can get paid more working down the street. And that's one of the challenges. Beaumont is a great facility. I spent 4 years of my career there. So it's not the facility, it's us being able to compete with the location.
And Director, finally, I remember hearing some concerns about or centered around officer safety because of staffing shortages where personnel that weren't necessarily trained as correctional officers, if you will, were being utilized in that capacity. Could you talk a little bit more about that? And if that's just a rumor, set all of us at ease about it.
Yes, Congresswoman, I absolutely appreciate the opportunity to set the record straight on here. First off, we would not put untrained people in there. We are very fortunate as a correctional agency. It's one of the things we pride ourselves on, that all of our staff are trained correctional workers. They receive the same training regardless of where they work. So we have uniformed staff that are correctional officers, and the nurses, the food service people, the teachers, everyone goes through the exact same training. That gives us the ability to utilize these staff safely. Okay, so that narrative is inaccurate when you hear it. We are challenged with staffing, and I'll tell you that we are funded at 90%. During my tour as director, our priority has been staffing. We have funded all of the positions that we get money for. As I mentioned earlier, at one point, I hired 1,000 over. My staff went 1,000 over. We're able to do that because our human resource know our attrition rate. So we try to get ahead of it, but it's a constant challenge. There's a lot of moving parts. It's a very large organization. 38,000 staff is a lot of people to keep track of.
Thank you so much, Director. Madam Chair, I'm out of time. I yield back. Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. Her time has expired. Thank you so very much. My pleasure to yield now 5 minutes to Congressman Stube. You're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Director, thanks for being here. Obviously, the committee has a lot of questions, and we appreciate your attendance today. On July 1st of last year, I wrote a letter to both you and the director of the DC Departments of Corrections about the treatment of the January 6th suspects. Your office responded on July 21st. The DC Department of Corrections has so far refused to answer, and we're almost a year after the fact that I sent the letter. Director, I recognize that many of the most egregious examples of mistreatment of January 6 inmates happen not in your system, but in the DC jail. It has been reported that January 6 inmates in the DC jail who are not vaccinated for COVID-19 are forced into solitary confinement for 14 days after meeting with their attorneys. Yes or no, does BOP have the same policy in your facilities?
No, Congressman, we do not.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. And that also highlights how out of step and illegal the policies of the DC jail regarding January 6 inmates is. It's also been reported that January 6 inmates in the DC jail have not been allowed haircuts or to attend religious services unless they are vaccinated for COVID-19. Yes or no, does BOP have the same policy?
No, Congressman, we treat all of people in our custody. Everybody has equal access and is treated with dignity and has access to everything equally.
This further shows, thank you for your response. This further shows how egregious the DC jail's mistreatment of January 6 inmates is. It has further been reported that January 6 inmates in the DC jail have been denied medical treatment, and this was largely the basis for a federal judge finding the warden in contempt. In your experience as a career law enforcement officer and a prison official, is this acceptable conduct by a correctional institution to deny medical treatment?
Congressman, I'm not going to comment on what another correctional agency does without knowing all the information. I can just stress to you that in the BOP, which is who I represent, everyone has equal access to medical care programs, community placement, things of that nature. I would
So in
DC Corrections.
So, well, I did, and they're not answering my questions. So I'm just highlighting the differences into how you run your agency and how they're running theirs. Additionally, I would like to ask for an update on the statistics provided to me in your office's response to that July 1st letter. If you know the answers offhand, that would be great, but I understand if you don't have that in front of you or you don't know. But I would like your commitment today to follow up with my office on the following. First, the number of January 6 inmates in BOP's custody that are awaiting trial and the number of such inmates who are in special housing units. Second, the number of January 6 inmates serving sentences and the number of such inmates who are in special housing units. I would ask your commitment today to get me those responses.
Yes, Congressman, I could get you those responses. I'm aware of, we have 19 in our custody. 8 of those are pretrial. As to their specific housing today, I don't want to misspeak, but I will certainly follow up with that information with your staff.
Okay, I would appreciate that. You said 19 in custody and how many in pretrial confinement?
19 in custody, 8 of those are pretrial. I don't know their exact status today. I don't want to misspeak.
If you could provide the details of that, not just to me, but I'm sure the members of this committee would also be interested in that information. I've got a little bit of time left, so one more question. In your office response to my letter, it was noted that judges, quote, routinely make recommendations to the Bureau regarding placement of an inmate at a specific institution or enrollment in programs. And your office also noted that the Bureau's policy requires, and I quote, a good faith effort to follow these judicial recommendations. I would point out that such judicial recommendations are often very much at the discretion of the judge. And while I generally have faith in our judiciary to fairly call balls and strikes on purely legal matters, on discretionary issues such as this, it is obviously possible for personal biases to come into play. So my question is this: if a judge makes a recommendation on the terms of a January 6 inmate's custody, and that recommendation was influenced by the judge's political leanings, BOP would be compelled by policy to make a good faith effort to follow that recommendation. Is that correct?
Congressman, recommendations that are made by the judiciary, we certainly respect them and work with them, but there's a lot of moving parts inside our agency. We make the final determination. It is simply that, a recommendation. We give it the look, but ultimately we make those decisions based on the best place to quarter and keep people safe and secure.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My time's expired.
Time has expired. Thank you. And it's my pleasure to now yield 5 minutes to the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Congresswoman Dean.
I thank you, Madam Chair, for hosting this important hearing. And I thank you, Director Carvajal, for your work. I was happy to hear last April before a Senate Judiciary Committee that BOP was working to expand mental health treatment and vocational training and life skills. I also hope that BOP is expanding substance use disorder treatment, recovery, therapy, and the rest. One thing I have in mind in particular are educational opportunities. We know they make all the difference in helping to break the cycle of recidivism and reincarceration, which is why I introduced Elijah Cummings' the PrEP Act, legislation that would ensure that incarcerated individuals receive educational opportunities they need to successfully re-enter their communities, re-enter their lives after completing their sentences. Can you give us an information on the number of people today enrolled in your system in educational opportunities?
Yes, Congresswoman, the information, the current information is we have over 75,000 inmates enrolled in one of our 80 evidence-based recidivism reducing programs or productive activities. Even since COVID, although we were hindered by the pandemic and we had to slow things down, over 151,000 inmates completed programming. Of course, the literacy programs, the GED, we offer many trades. We have over 200 career technical educations. We've done a lot of work with expanding programs specifically for the female offenders. We have dedicated staff just to make sure that we process that population's special and unique needs. We are working with the Department of Labor to expand apprenticeship programs because we know that vocational trades help people get jobs when they go out.
And some of the things that the PrEP Act would do would be higher education. College credits. What percentage of inmates are enrolled in educational programming?
Congresswoman, I don't have the exact numbers off my head, but I'll certainly follow up. I'm sure we can get you that information.
Okay, terrific. If you would share that with the committee, that would be great. What programs are in place regarding addiction and substance use disorder? What percentage of inmates struggle with either mental health or addiction? And how many are being offered treatment?
Congresswoman, we have many drug abuse programs available. We have our residential drug abuse program that is one of our best evidence-based programs. We also, under the First Step Act, we expanded our MAT treatments. It targets a specific subset for the opioid people with opioid use disorder, and we currently work on expanding those treatments. I don't know the exact percentage. It is a high amount of people that come into our system with drug and alcohol abuse programs. I don't have the exact percentages, but we can certainly get them to you.
I would really appreciate it if we could get the percentages, and also to understand if treatment is universally available throughout the system. We know that there is a high correlation of addiction, substance use disorder, and incarceration. On to solitary confinement in the few minutes that I have left. We read reports, we hear from inmates and their families on the dangerous side effects of solitary confinement, the serious lasting psychological damage, contrary to the very set of questions I just asked you. Pre-pandemic, it was conservatively estimated that 60,000 to 80,000 people were confined to solitary. And we understand that solitary may have been used as a substitute during COVID for isolation, medically required isolation. Can you give us an update on the use of solitary confinement? And importantly, I hope, on a recognition that it is a failed practice.
As Congresswoman, we average around 9,000 inmates at any given time in our restrictive housing units. About 8,000 of those are for administrative purposes, pending placements, conducting investigations. Sometimes there's separations for their own safety. There was 1,100 in there pending disciplinary action. We try to make that, we try to use alternative sanctions, and we try to limit the time that someone spends in restrictive housing. One of the things that we've done to address this issue, for just some of the reasons you stated, is that we've expanded our what we call a reintegration housing unit program, which allows that group of inmates who tend to spend time in restrictive housing, a general population type atmosphere, a smaller general population, so that we can remove them from restrictive housing. So that is something that we monitor daily. We're committed to ensuring that everyone in there has access to programming they do, medical and everything else. We also ensure that we make rounds daily and check on the inmates. They have constant inmate contact.
Director, I thank you for your questions, your answers, and I look forward to the information coming to the committee, and I yield back.
Thank you, young lady. Her time has expired, and I'm pleased to yield 5 minutes to Mr. Tiffany. Ms. Tiffany, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and good morning, Madam Chair.
Morning.
First of all, Director, can those that were fired as a result of not taking your staff, as a result of not taking the vaccine, can they get their jobs back?
Congressman, we have processes for all that, and I'm certain that we will follow them, and Ford does the appropriate due process, following OPM guidance and regulations and all the rules and laws.
Is prison ministries allowed in the Bureau of Prisons?
Yes, Congressman, they are.
Have they been in during COVID?
Well, we had to restrict through our COVID operations, obviously, people coming in for their safety and for ours. We don't want to introduce COVID into our environments. So it's been restrictive, but we worked on that. We have a matrix out there operational. If the institution CEO, if they fall into that criteria, they can make those adjustments daily. For any given place, Congressman, I can't answer that today, but we can certainly get you the information if you're interested in a specific location.
Please do that. With the explosion in crime in the United States the last couple of years, have you seen an increase in the inmate population in the Bureau of Prisons?
Actually, Congressman, our population has decreased over the last several years.
Is part of that as a result of the COVID releases that you've done? I think you detailed those numbers earlier.
Yes, Congressman, it is. And please keep in mind that we're on the back end of the criminal justice system. So it takes time to go through the system. So I would defer some of that information probably to the DOJ. We get them at the back end of it.
Thank you very much. Whether you're vaccinated or unvaccinated, you can still contract COVID-19. why are we still releasing inmates?
Congressman, if I understand your correction, or your question correctly, under the CARES Act, is that what your question is? Why are we releasing inmates under the CARES Act?
Yeah. Yes.
Because it is a statute, we're following it, the guidance that we were given, so we follow the law, Congressman.
Do you think we should rethink that as a Congress that sets this policy, or can change the policy?
Congressman, I would defer to you and the members of Congress to answer that.
So we had the 2 stabbing deaths down in, I believe it's the Beaumont facility in Texas. Prior to the stabbing incident, if these 2 people would have had COVID, is it possible they could have asked for release under the law?
Well, Congressman, I want to make sure I paint the right picture here. We're going to appropriately review everybody by the criteria, but the security level where this incident happened, and the fact that these individuals were members of security threat groups and at a high security, the chances of them being released were probably very slim, because one of the criteria is you cannot have a crime of violence, and it appears that these individuals were involved in violence. Precisely why prisons exist. There are a small fraction of people as these that are going to continue their criminal activity.
So it's not completely ruled out that they could have gotten release.
Congressman, that's why we have the criteria and we utilize our good discretion and judgment and follow that statute.
Federal prison inmates are keeping large sums of money, as much as $100,000 each, in government-run deposit accounts, effectively shielded from court orders, including people like the pedophile Larry Nassar, the Boston bomber, Mr. Tsarnaev. What specific plans does the Bureau have in place to ensure victims get what they are owed?
Hey, Congressman, good question. First off, I want to stress something that currently the BOP does not have the authority to seize funds independently from an inmate without their consent. We are working with the Department of Justice to change that rule that will allow us to automatically encumber funds or a portion of their funds to pay fines and restitution. Our inmate trust fund collects about $6 million annually to make sure that they pay restitution. But I stress again that we don't independently have the authority to retrieve funds. We work with other law enforcement entities. In that case, the United States Marshal's Office, the United States Attorney's Office, and the courts in those manners when we have to do that.
Yeah, I think that's something, Madam Chair, that should really be looked at. The other thing that I would urge, Madam Chair, we need to hear, after hearing Mr. Stubbe's questioning, and I'm so glad the representative from Pennsylvania was concerned about solitary confinement. We need to have a hearing on the January 6th detainees. We need to have a full airing of what is going on with those January 6th detainees, because they're being submitted to conditions that many on this committee, including the other side of the aisle, find reprehensible. It's time to have a hearing on January 6th detainees. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. The gentleman's time has expired, and I'm pleased to yield to the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Scanlon. You're recognized now for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate you having this hearing today. And thank you, Director Carvajal, for being with us. I was hoping you could help me clarify just for a minute kind of the baseline population that we're talking about here. Sorry. So as I understand it, the inmate population for the Bureau of Prisons from 1940 to 1980 was around 24,000. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am. If my memory serves me correctly, yes. I don't have that information right in front of me.
I'm actually pulling it off your website here. But so then the population doubled in the 80s to about 58,000, doubled again in the 90s to 136,000, and continued to climb until 2013, at which point the Bureau of Prisons was housing about 217,000 people. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. And so what is your current census of inmates in the Bureau of Prisons?
I'm not sure I understand your question, Congresswoman.
So are you currently housing about 153,000 inmates?
Oh, Yeah, yes, I'm sorry. I just didn't hear you. About 153,000, 134,000 in our 120 bureau facilities. There's about 6,200 in 4 private contract facilities, 7,100 in RRCs, and the 5,400 I mentioned on home confinement for CARES Act.
Okay, thank you. I was having trouble figuring out where all the numbers were.
But yes, those are rough estimates. They change daily.
Okay. And I think everyone on the committee knows that by the time we got to, 2013 or so, we had widespread agreement, everyone from the Koch brothers to the Obama Justice Department saying we are over incarcerating people in this country. And it's a huge financial drain as well as a huge waste of human capital and a human rights problem. Now, there's been some emphasis on the purpose of the Bureau of Prisons to be punishment, but it also has a rehabilitative purpose, doesn't it?
Yes, Congresswoman, I'd like to stress something that we're not here for punishment. The taking of their time by the courts and the criminal justice system, that's the punishment. We're here to house people that are remanded to our custody, and more importantly, to prepare them to reenter society, keep them safe while we're here. We're not here as punishment. That's not how we look at this agency.
Okay, and I'm particularly interested, as some of my colleagues have been, in the rehabilitative function, the efforts that are made to ensure that when people are released from prison, they're able to successfully re-enter, and that they're not, worse off than they were before they went in, because that doesn't seem to serve society well either. What is the current recidivism rate, to your knowledge, from the federal prisons?
It's about 43%.
Okay, you might want to update the website. It says 34%. Has there been a significant change in recent years?
No, ma'am. I'll have to have my staff look at that website. I'm not familiar with it being in the 30s.
Okay, it's on the homepage.
I understand. We'll correct it.
Okay, so with respect to my colleague Ms. Dean talked a little bit about some of the educational programs. I recently had a constituent reach out about a relative's participation in the Bureau of Prisons Drug Abuse Rehabilitation Program, or RDAP. And they've encountered problems getting all their earned credits counted towards release because the program was paused by COVID-19. And eventually this constituent's relative was able to get the credits, but they had to go to court. And that's not a particularly cost-effective method of dealing with this for anyone. I know that RDAP was paused at many facilities. Is that still the case? And if not, is it back up and running at all facilities where it was previously offered?
Yes, Congresswoman, as I stated earlier, COVID certainly impacts our institutions. We have operational matrix that dictates how they operate. We have been affected by it. I know that certain inmates have been affected. We expect our staff to work with them. I'm not familiar with the particular case you're talking about, but we can certainly get back with you on that, the specifics of that case. But otherwise, we go to the point of trying to work with them so that they can benefit from home confinement, finishing the program, getting their time credits. The whole goal is for them to get the time credits. Again, I'd like to stress that we're not trying to keep people in except unless they need to be in. If they are earning time credits, we want them to go back to society as appropriate.
Okay, one last question. I'm running out of time. I was very interested in the effort to put more apprenticeship programs in there so that people have hard skills that are going to enable them to become employed when they get out. What is the trajectory on that? How many places have apprenticeship programs, and what efforts are being made to expand that?
Your time has expired. Director, I'll allow you to answer the question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Congresswoman, we can get back with you with that specific information. We are working with the Department of Labor to grow that program.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it. Yield back.
Thank the gentlelady for her questioning. Now it's my privilege to yield 5 minutes to Mr. Massey. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I want to thank you, Director Carvajal, for your staff being responsive to one of my inquiries about how many vaccination exemptions have been granted at the BOP. It looks like as of January 20th, there were 4,738 exemptions. Most of them were religious exemptions. Instead of asking you, I want to inform you that this has had a very negative effect on the morale of the officers. The fact that they are required to live under a vaccine mandate and the inmates are not. It's interesting that the inmates have more rights than the officers themselves. They also resent that they've had to apply for religious exemptions when in fact they should have been granted a medical exemption, but at least some of them have been able to get the exemptions. And you may want to check in on whether you've completely suspended this mandate, because there are officers who are still required to do the weekly testing if they're not vaccinated per the mandate, and also to certify that they have a religious exemption. Even as of this week, they've had to do that. So, but I appreciate the accommodations that you have made, because it will negatively affect morale and recruiting if we do keep this vaccine mandate in place. I want to ask you how many correctional officers were budgeted for the BOP by Congress? I think I'll give you my number. It's not a gotcha. The number I have, I'm just trying to see if it's correct, is 20,446.
That, yes, Congressman, again, I appreciate the opportunity to clarify that. Specific correctional officers, what we call the correctional officer that work those posts, is approximately 14,000. The 20,000 you're referring to is 6,000 additional support positions that fall under the correctional officer series. This is a classification issue, and it's often confusing. That encumbers other positions that work in correctional services, but the actual true correctional officers that we look at is approximately 14,000.
Have the 6,000 been hired?
We have currently, Congressman, about 1,100 correctional officer vacancies right now. Almost half of those are at 7 locations that are hard to fill.
Okay. There's one facility in my district, the Ashland FCI, where 5 years ago they had 130 officers, and now they have 100, and they're told they're going to 98, yet they've got more inmates. And we see that augmentation is being used there. So I'm concerned that the inmates are going up and the officers are going down, because I'd like for it to be a safe environment. And I think if it's understaffed, it's not safe. Also, they're utilizing overtime virtually every day at that facility. And it would be cheaper for the taxpayers if we had more slots filled. And I've heard that augmentation is being used there to backfill some of those slots. And I'm not going to debate whether they're trained enough. You've already addressed that, and you assured us that they are. But what is augmentation, and where do those people come from when they go serve in roles that correctional officers might otherwise fill? Oh, I think you're muted, Director.
Sorry. Augmentation is a necessary tool that we use in our agency to make sure that we complete the first part of our mission first, and that's to keep everyone safe and secure in order to be able to do the second part of our mission, which is give people a chance to return. As you stated, we try not to do it, but it's certainly a tool that we have to use. We use people from other disciplines, such as teachers, nurses, things of that nature. We try to limit that. Those decisions are based upon a roster locally. The CEO makes those determinations. I stated earlier, we have approximately 1,100 correctional officer vacancies. I'd like to stress, Congressman, that we are funded at 90%. We have 38,884 positions. We are funded for 35,161. That's about 3,723 vacancies, that about $500 million we're short. Our correctional officer fill rate got as high as 94%. It's currently 92%. So our goal is to fill every single position that we are funded for, but I can't spend money we don't have.
Okay, well, I would like for you to look specifically at Ashland FCI. And my concern about augmentation should be a concern we all have, is when you take people away from being teachers to being guards or other services, then the teaching doesn't happen. And then we could see higher recidivism, because we know that vocational schools and education correlate to recidivism. So I would hope that you can get those slots filled, that we can get more slots. We can rely less on overtime and less on pulling those teachers away who are so important and the other people who are important for complying with First Step Act. So thank you, Madam Chairwoman, for indulging me, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. It's my privilege now to yield 5 minutes to the gentlelady from Georgia, and I thank her for her very powerful remarks this morning at the National Prayer Breakfast. Gentlelady from Georgia, Ms. McBath, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Lee, and good afternoon, Director Carvajal. I thank you for being here today, and I thank you for your service as the director, as you will soon be leaving the Bureau. And we just want to thank you for your service. During this subcommittee's last hearing, we had an opportunity to review implementation of the First Step Act and at the BOP and the impact that COVID-19 has had on the BOP operations. I used that opportunity to inquire at that time into the BOP's policies addressing the treatment and care of pregnant women, specifically the BOP's alignment with national guidance for the health and safety of pregnant women. Since that time, I was pleased to hear that the BOP has taken actions to better align its policies on about 5 of the 8 care topics that the GAO found to not fully be aligned with the national guidance recommendations. And I hope that the Bureau will continue to work to ensure that all 8 of those care topics are met so that the health and well-being of pregnant women at the BOP facilities is they're fully protected and cared for. Today, however, I do want to examine how BOP is handling its reentry services. The successful reentry of citizens into society is integral to anti-recidivism efforts, crime in our communities, and the financial health of these offenders rejoining society. However, it's kind of difficult to, actually to assess recidivism patterns unless you are properly collecting the data on it. For example, the last federal justice statistics publication on recidivism of federal offenders that I was able to locate was published in June 2016. And the latest publication on the employment statuses of released federal offenders was published last December, but covers federal inmates released back in 2010. So further, the latest BOP publication on recidivism that I was able to find was from 2006. So Director Carvajal, what steps has the BOP taken to improve its data collection to more effectively track the progress of incarcerated individuals as they transition from prison to reentry centers or home confinement? And does the BOP have plans to create standard metrics to evaluate reentry outcomes, such as job placement, recidivism, so that the BOP facilities can share their best practices?
Yes, Congresswoman, I appreciate your interest in this. This is very important to us. It's a very complicated process with the gathering of recidivism data. We work in conjunction with the states and other law enforcement entities. We are not sole owners of that data. I will tell you that my staff are working with other components to set up a platform, and we're committed to working on bettering that platform to get that data and to track it.
And sir, then once that is done or initiated and completed, could you just please, I would love, my staff, we would love to have what that platform looks like and what it entails, if you would.
Yes, we can do that, Congresswoman.
Thank you. And I'm also curious to know how many reentry coordinators that the Board of Prisons have per prison or per prisoner. How many vacancies are there for these jobs? You've made mention of, the number of vacancies that you have, but how many vacancies are for these jobs, and what steps has the Board of Prisons taken to fill these positions?
Yes, Congresswoman, we are committed to filling all our vacancies. As I stated earlier, we strive to do that. I don't know the exact number of reentry affairs coordinators, but those are positions that we strive to fill as we do all of our positions. And as I stated earlier, we are filled every position we have funding for, and we're committed to continue to do that. I can get you the exact numbers. I can get back with you on that. I don't have them in front of me.
No, we really appreciate that effort. I think my colleagues and I would be really interested to have that information, and I really appreciate that. Well, as has been stated by many of my colleagues before me, we're very, very concerned about, people say that criminals have rights, and yes, they do have rights, just as victims have rights. And we just want to make sure that when those that are incarcerated do have the ability to have fair treatment while they are incarcerated, because at the end of the day, they're human beings too. And thank you so much, Madam Chair. I yield back the balance of my time.
The lady has yielded back. Thank you. It is my privilege now to yield 5 minutes to, if I might. Gentlemen, Mr. Fitzgerald, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sorry about that.
That's
My colleagues on the other side of the aisle introduced several pieces of legislation that would eliminate bail in the federal system and make states that utilize bail for pretrial release ineligible for grants under the Edward Byrne Memorial Justice Assistance Grant Program. These reforms continue to be pushed in the wake of the tragic events where violent criminals are released either on bond or when they're involved in some of these terrible crimes, of which some of my colleagues have been talking about this morning. Jurisdictions in California, Maryland, New Jersey, New York, and in my own district, which I represent, Milwaukee County, has modified their bail practices to eliminate or de-emphasize the use of monetary bail systems. Coupled with, I think, some of my colleagues desire, which has been going on for a year, discussions about defunding or dismantling the police departments or bail reform efforts. It's troubling, I think, and it's making some of the communities less safe, or it's sending the wrong signal or message to some of these individuals that ultimately commit these crimes. Additionally, the Pretrial Integrity and Safety Act would provide grants to states if they eliminate their money bail systems. And then things like the Minnesota Freedom Fund, of which, even Vice President Harris was involved in for a period of time. So this fund and others that are similar have kind of contributed, I think, to this overall concern. And then right in my backyard in the 5th Congressional District in Wisconsin, we had the national attention given to the Waukesha Christmas Parade murders that happened. Daryl Brooks, the individual, was released on a $1,000 bond after running over a woman with a vehicle. This is prior to the parade. And then he was released on bail despite having a lengthy criminal history, including a charge for aggravated battery and an outstanding warrant in Nevada after skipping bail for a sex-related crime. And then, as you know, he subsequently drove his car through the Christmas parade in Waukesha, Wisconsin, killing 6 individuals, one of whom was an 8-year-old boy. Bail reform policies such as cashless bail have been supported by some of my colleagues actually do more harm than help in what I would consider some of the minority communities that could have benefited from, I think, some of these reforms as we discuss them at the state and federal level. So, Director, I guess crimes that are considered felonies are being treated as misdemeanors or civil infractions, in controlling kind of the criminal and the justice system from the perspective of the benefit always goes kind of to the criminal. What's the fallout? And I know you talked about this earlier, but under the first step, the Act calls upon prisons to create rules around evidence-based recidivism reduction programs and productive activity. Can you comment? I mean, there has to be a relationship between those incarcerated and certainly the set of statutes, both at the state and federal level, and how they affect that. What's the interaction during your period of time as director?
Congressman, I'm not sure I understand your question. We're committed to reentry. That's 50% part of our mission. The other is keeping people safe and secure. We don't control who comes to our custody. That's on the front end of the justice system. The courts determine that. So when they come in here, our mission is to keep everyone safe and secure and ensure that they have equal access to programming. And as I stated before, 95% of those people return to society.
Just one more quick one then. One of my experience as a state legislator, as well as I think in kind of the relationship that I've tried to develop with the federal system within the state of Wisconsin, one of the things that's always linked is the literacy rate compared to recidivism. We find that if an inmate can read at an 8th grade level, they're far likely to recommit. Is that something you guys have looked at or checked into? And is it something that you monitor?
Yes, Congressman, we have lots of literacy programs, the high school equivalency, GED, and we encourage inmates. That's part of the risk and needs assessment when they come in. We assess them and we address their needs. We assign them programs to address their needs. That's precisely what the First Step Act is for. We were doing that all along. We've had a risk and needs assessment. We just formalized it under the First Step Act.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman for his questioning. Now I'm pleased to yield to the gentlelady from St. Louis, Missouri, Vice Chair of this committee. Congressman Bush, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
St. Louis, and I thank you, Chairwoman, for convening this important hearing. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the experiences of 17 women across 5 federal facilities, which have been provided by the National Council of Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. In these emails, women in federal custody detail horrifying accounts of not being allowed to get out of their beds all day because of COVID lockdowns, being forced to eat expired food, having little to no access to medical services to treat cancers and other underlying conditions, having to pay $2 to file a sick complaint. This is all happening under your watch. These are complaints coming from not one or not 2 facilities, but 5 different facilities, which makes clear that these issues are not isolated, but they're systemic. These women cannot hold you accountable, Mr. Carvajal. They cannot, but we can. And I would like to use this opportunity to ask you questions that they cannot directly ask you out of fear of retaliation. So Mr. Carvajal, yes or no, are you aware of these complaints across so many of your facilities?
Congresswoman, I'm not aware of those particular complaints, but I'm certainly interested in hearing from you and your staff so that we can look into them, because I find that if that happened, I find it unacceptable.
Thank you. Thank you. Our staff will be in touch. Thank you for that. Are complaints filed by people in BOP custody being logged, and am I able to access those logs?
We absolutely keep a log of complaints. We take all allegations seriously. We have an Office of Internal Affairs. We follow the process. We work with the Office of Inspector General, and when needed, other law enforcement agencies, and certainly the FBI and investigatory agencies. We take all of those complaints and allegations seriously, and we look into them.
Am I able to access the logs?
Congresswoman, if you'd like, I could have my staff reach out to you, see if we have particular information you're interested in, and if we can, we will provide that to you.
Thank you. Thank you. In the midst of a raging pandemic that has made incarcerated individuals uniquely vulnerable, rather than allowing people to serve their sentences from their homes with their families and away from the trauma and abuse of the BOP system, the federal prison population has grown. Keeping them in prison, it is an act of cruelty. In April of last year, you told the Senate Judiciary Committee that 50 to 75% of those incarcerated have been reviewed for home confinement, and that 24,000 out of over 150,000 people in federal custody have been placed in home confinement. As of today, have all of those incarcerated been reviewed for home confinement now instead of the 50 to 75%?
Congresswoman, we review all eligible inmates for home confinement under the CARES Act. We did that. We've placed over 37,000 inmates. 9,000 of those, more than 9,000 were specific under CARES Act placement. Those are 9,000 inmates that would not be out in community custody at this point in their incarceration. And our population is actually reduced, Congresswoman.
Okay, well, we looked at the website earlier today. So is the website inaccurate?
I'm not certain which information you're referring to.
We went to the Bureau, the Federal Bureau of Prisons website. 2 weeks ago, I, along with Representative Bonnie Watson Coleman, we sent a letter seeking clarification from the Bureau on the implementation of the Office of Legal Counsel's new guidance for those on home confinement under the CARES Act. We asked for a response no later than February the 7th of this year. Can we get a commitment from you that such a response is forthcoming, Mr. Carvajal?
Congresswoman, I'm aware of your letter, and we are certainly working on answering it. Understand, please, that there is a clearance process of which I do not control, but we are committed to getting you a response to your letter.
Thank you. My office will be in contact. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Thank you very much. It's my pleasure now to yield to the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Owens, for 5 minutes. Mr. Owens, you're recognized for 5 minutes. We'll then be happy now to move to the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline. We're pleased to yield Mr. Cicilline 5 minutes. You're recognized now.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Director, for being here. I too joined the letter that Congresswoman Bush just referenced and very much look forward to your response to that. We held a hearing on January 21st to learn more about the Bureau of Prisons' response to the pandemic, and specifically discuss compassionate release as a tool to reduce prison occupancy and keep people safe. And so my first question is, I have a piece of legislation that would expand compassionate release availability during a public health emergency. And given all of the evidence we've seen about successful reintegration through compassionate release during COVID, it seems to me that it makes sense to fully utilize this tool. And so my first question is, what is the Bureau of Prisons' current policy for considering compassionate release of individuals at high risk of serious illness from COVID-19?
Congressman, the compassionate release process is sometimes confused with the home confinement, which we use. It's a quicker placement. The reduction in sentence process is much more difficult. It wasn't designed to be a timely process. Each individual has to be reviewed in unique, extraordinary, and compelling circumstances.
So, Director, so is it my understanding you don't use compassionate release or recommend compassionate release relating to people who have a serious risk of illness with COVID-19? You don't use that process at all?
Under the CARES Act, we review everyone for placement in home confinement, but yes, we do. If they file a reduction in sentence motion, we do evaluate it and assess it under our policy. We just don't independently release someone from our custody. We make.
No, I know you don't. My question is, do you use compassionate release of individuals at a high risk of serious illness from COVID? And what is your current policy in terms of applying compassionate release to such individuals? That's not a hard question.
If they submit a request, we follow our policy in the statute and review it. If it's appropriate, we make the motion. If not, it is denied.
Okay. Healthcare workers across the country are obviously experiencing incredible burnout after 2 years fighting on the front lines of this pandemic. I presume that correctional staff feel similarly, especially during outbreaks in the facilities. And given the statistics I've seen on overtime and infection rates, and considering the ongoing risk of COVID-19 and continued staffing shortages and BOP's expanded authority to release individuals to home confinement, why is BOP not utilizing mitigation strategies like compassionate release more fully to reduce the number of incarcerated individuals in federal prison?
We are utilizing it, Congressman. We make recommendations to the court as appropriate. The court makes a final decision, not the BOP. If the motion is made up by the inmate under the First Step Act, which they can do that after 30 days, we don't take a position on the motion. We're not party to those cases. It goes through the system.
Director, my colleague Congressman Dean raised questions about solitary confinement, and the number she referenced I concur with, and the number increased 500% in 2020 with about 300,000 people in solitary confinement at any one time. The policy of using solitary or restrictive housing as a substitute for CDC recommended medical isolation has caused unbelievable harms to incarcerated individuals. And so my question is, what steps has the BOP leadership taken to ensure that it's following the appropriate guidance, like the CDC guidance, place people in medical isolation, not solitary confinement or restrictive housing during this or in any future public health emergency?
Congressman, we follow the CDC guidance. And in some cases, we go above and beyond. I'd like to clarify, though, that medical isolation is often confused with solitary confinement. There are instances when inmates placed in restrictive housing are isolated, also medically isolated. In those cases, it's appropriate. We don't place people from the general population who are placed in medical isolation. We don't place them in restrictive housing. If there's a case where it's an issue where we're out of space or something, they're appropriately tagged. So they're not treated, there's different rules for that.
Director, in February 2020, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture issued a statement related to the use of solitary confinement in United States prisons, stating that, and I quote, "The severe and often irreparable psychological and physical consequences of solitary confinement and social exclusion are well documented, can range from progressively severe forms of anxiety, stress, and depression to cognitive impairment and suicidal tendencies. This deliberate infliction of severe mental pain or suffering may well amount to psychological torture," end quote. So my question is the BOP aware of the mental and physical damage of solitary confinement on the individuals in their care? And do you have policies in place to try to reduce the use of solitary confinement? And will you furnish this committee with all of the background and supporting documents to reveal to us really the status of the use of solitary confinement and your efforts to mitigate it? I think you're on mute, Mr. Director.
Sorry. Yes, Congressman, that's a lot of information. We will certainly get that to you. I will tell you that we are committed to continuing to appropriately reduce our use of restrictive housing. In some cases, there's a reason for it. We do, but we have policies in place, making rounds, making sure that they have access to programming and earning time credits. We can get you all that information and we can answer any questions you like regarding that.
I appreciate that. And just Director, one final point, the making rounds is not, the fact that you check in on somebody while they're experiencing what has been described as psychological torture isn't sufficient. So I look forward to that information. I thank the chairwoman and I yield.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. Thank you. And my pleasure now to yield to the distinguished gentleman from California, among many of our members on this committee. We yield to you, Mr. Liu, for 5 minutes. You're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Sheila Jackson-Lee, for holding this important oversight hearing. Thank you, Director Carvajal, for your public service. Approximately how many COVID-19 vaccines did the Bureau of Prisons administer?
Congressman, we've administered to date over 292,000 doses to both staff and inmates. 80% of our staff, give or take, 80% are vaccinated, and about 70% of our inmate population. It's a moving target because there's always people coming in and out. Every single person is offered the opportunity to be vaccinated.
Did anyone die as a result of getting the COVID-19 vaccine?
Congressman, I do not know that. I would have to get you information from our medical doctor. I don't have that information in front of me.
Sir, you would have been told if someone died after getting COVID-19 vaccine, wouldn't you have?
I'm sure I would have, Congressman. I just don't have that information in front of me.
Yeah, so once you get back to us, but I'm going to tell you, you would have been told if that in fact happened. Now, did you see that the CDC recently came out saying that if you get a COVID-19 vaccine and a booster shot, you are 97 times less likely to die than if you're unvaccinated from COVID? Are you aware of that?
Yes, Congressman.
Okay. So I want to agree with the former president who said that COVID-19 vaccines are one of the greatest achievements of mankind. And I want to talk about the religious exemptions. I happen to be Catholic. The Pope, who is also called the Vicar of Christ, has said that getting a COVID-19 vaccine is a moral obligation. what I want to know is, were the Bureau of Prisons giving any religious exemptions to folks who were Catholic? And if so, what possible basis could that be on?
Congressman, I don't personally review those exemptions. We have processes in place, and I'm certain that we can get you that information. We have actually ceased, because of the preliminary injunction, we've ceased process of religious and medical exemptions for the time being.
If you could get me the information, that would be great. And now, Chairwoman Jackson Lee, I'd like to enter 2 articles for the record. The first is from Forbes Magazine, June 19, 2020. It's titled, Bureau of Prisons Special Tactical Forces Under Scrutiny for Use in DC Protests and Training Mishaps. The second article is titled, The Story Behind Bill Barr's Unmarked Federal Agents from Politico, and it's dated June 5th, 2020. So Director Carvajal, I'd like to ask you, were Bureau of Prisons personnel used to crack down on protesters, and were they in fact unmarked?
Congressman, we did assist the Department of Justice and other law enforcement components during those protests initially, and I was asked this question during a press conference. Initially, within the first few days, our staff were not properly marked, in essence, for people on the civilian side to recognize them. They had local institution logos. We corrected that within a couple of days. We appropriately marked them to show they were Bureau of Prisons personnel. It was an oversight. And when it came to our attention, we appropriately marked them. They all now, when deployed, if deployed, they're appropriately marked to indicate they're operating under the Federal Bureau of Prisons, that they are federal officers.
So for any future occurrences, they will all be identified. Am I understanding that correctly?
We corrected the issue before the end of that, and we have deployed them since, and they are all appropriately identified as Federal Bureau of Prisons officers.
There are also allegations that there was excessive use of force, that some of them may have used tear gas and other actions that were not appropriate. So my question goes to training. These Bureau of Prison folks, they're trained to deal with prison issues. Do they also get training on dealing with crowds who are exercising the First Amendment right to free speech?
Yes, Congressman, I know that some of those things are under current review, so I don't think it'd be appropriate for me to comment on them. I can check back with my staff or the status of that, and we can answer your questions offline. I don't want to misspeak in this forum if that is still the matter's still under review.
Thank you. If you give me that information, it's important because I've introduced a bill with Congressman Earl Blumenauer that will prevent the Attorney General from randomly deputizing, actually the U.S. Marshals, randomly deputizing Bureau of Prison folks and then sending them out to cities to crack down on First Amendment free speech folks who are exercising that right. With that, I yield back.
Close my fingers again, but thank you very much, Mr. Liu, for your questioning. And it's certainly my privilege now to yield to another important distinguished member of this whole body, and that is Mr. Cohen of Tennessee. Mr. Cohen of Tennessee, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. If I ask any questions that have been asked earlier, Mr. Carvajal, let me know. I've been at a hearing of the Helsinki Commission. We had the Polish foreign minister, and been very involved in those issues. These are important issues as well, and I wanted to make this hearing, and I'm happy I can. The pandemic has highlighted many of the failings of our federal prison system, and the Bureau of Prisons has unfortunately failed to protect the health of those within their custody and their staff from COVID-19 or address chronic understaffing. The BOP has also lacked transparency and vigor in implementing important criminal justice reforms, such as the First Step Act, Mr. Carvajal. What lessons have you learned during your tenure, and what advice do you have for your successor to address some of these issues that we've seen within the Bureau of Prisons? Mr. Carvajal?
Congressman, yeah, sorry.
Yes, sir.
Trying to unmute here. Well, if you're asking about the lessons learned from the pandemic, first off, we followed CDC guidance from day one. We learned that we need to protect the most vulnerable, the elderly, isolate the sick, quarantine the exposed, the same lessons that the rest of the country and the world have known: restrict movement, communicate better. Those are some of the lessons learned. And I think that we've got good processes in place. We work with the CDC. We've invited them into our institutions. They have visited us, and our pandemic plan is worked in collaboration with the CDC.
Well, let me ask you about the First Step Act. That was one of the few successes Mr. Trump had, that and the Operation Warp Speed. That seemed like it should have been pursued with vigor, and it wasn't. Why was First Step Act and trying to get individuals that should be eligible for release, not Operation Warp Speed for the Bureau of Prisons?
Congressman, I'm not sure I know what you're referring to. We are fully compliant, statutory compliant with the First Step Act, and we had implemented a risk and needs assessment way ahead of the time it was due. We formalized it. We've released inmates under the First Step Act. They're earning time credits. I'm not certain what you're referring to.
Was there a date late January that you needed to have a certain report in on folks that would be eligible for release? Maybe you got it done. I don't know, but at one point it wasn't done.
Well, we were awaiting the finalization of the rule of the process, which I don't control. We submitted that draft rule under the last administration at the end of January 20, and it was finalized in January. We are statutorily compliant with the First Step Act, Congressman.
Excellent. Well, that's good. I led a letter along with Representative Bonnie Watson Coleman to the Biden administration, urging them to avoid the reincarceration of those released to home confinement under the CARES Act, allowing those released to apply for commutations of their sentences. In your view, was home confinement under the CARES Act successful, number one? And do you agree that those released have largely proven their ability to successfully assimilate back into their homes, families, and communities?
Congressman, we're always committed to returning people to society. 95% of our people will go. We understand and support the CARES Act. We've done so. We've released over 37,000 to home confinement, 9,000 of those under the CARES Act. Only 320 of those have reoffended, and we follow the statute and the rules. So we follow the laws that are implemented, and we continue to do so.
The Department of Justice Office of Legal Counsel published a memorandum concluding that the Bureau of Prisons was not required to return those released to home confinement under the CARES Act to prison once the emergency period ended. But has the Bureau of Prisons, under your guidance, begun taking steps to effectuate the Department of Justice memorandum and new interpretation of the law so that the people that were on home confinement would be able to remain on home confinement and apply for commutations?
Yes, Congressman, I'm aware of the OLC opinion. We're working with the department. We have not nailed down the how. When we do that, we will be as transparent as possible to make sure that everyone gets the information. But we certainly take the information and guidance of the Attorney General. Will continue to follow the laws.
Thank you, sir. Let me ask you this. You were the head of the Bureau of Prisons, were you not, when Mr. Epstein allegedly committed suicide?
No, I was not, Congressman.
You weren't? Okay. You were there, though, when Michael Cohen was arrested and brought back and put in solitary confinement when he tried to exercise his First Amendment rights, were you not?
I believe that did happen under my tour, yes.
Did you have anything to do with that? Were you made aware of it, the desire to have him brought back into custody and put in solitary confinement?
No, Congressman, I was not made aware of that prior to. I was briefed on it afterwards because he's a high publicity case, as any high publicity, but I was not directly involved in that decision.
Well, thank you. Based on last question, Madam Chair, since Mr. Epstein committed suicide and the security there was awful, have you seen to it that Miss Maxwell's got better care or supervision to make sure she doesn't do anything to end her life?
I'll let the director answer the question.
Thank
The
you.
gentleman's time has expired. Director, may I answer?
Yes, Congressman. I don't want to discuss specific security issues on any individual, but we appropriately ensure that people in our care have the appropriate supervision and security.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. This has been an important hearing, insightful approaches by our members on both sides of the aisle. And so as we come to a conclusion, Mr. Biggs, as ranking member, do you have any additional points that you might want to place on the record at this time?
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, thank you, Director, again for being here. And I look forward to the number of responses that you indicated to me that you would have your staff get to me. I look forward to seeing those. And Madam Chair, I'll yield back to you.
I thank the gentleman very much. Director, just one final point that comes out of the testimony of Dr. Homer Venters, who is an adjunct faculty at the NYU College of Global Health, who was with us in our previous hearing. His investigation revealed a disturbing lack of access to care when a new medical problem is encountered. We've heard those questions, line of questioning coming from several members. This process called sick call in most carceral settings relies on the ability of incarcerated people to submit a written or electronic concern and then be seen in a face-to-face encounter with a day or two. In the first BOP facility that he had the time to had the opportunity to visit, as he inspected the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, New York, it quickly became apparent that not only were many people reporting that their sick call requests, including COVID-19 symptoms, were being ignored, but that the facility was actually destroying their original request, which violates basic correctional standards. As this is an accountability hearing and it is a recognition that there should be, if you will, accountability and the exercise of punitive measures, we all have concluded that these are human beings deserving of restoration and dignity, men and women. Can you comment on that kind of action?
Yes, Congresswoman, I appreciate you allowing me to clarify that. First off, I am aware of the report. We looked into it. We followed up. I won't discuss that specific incident, but I will reassure you that each of our institutions has an outpatient hair clinic. It's overseen by a board state certified physician and a medical director. We have outside oversight. We have Joint Commission, AAAHC, ACA. We've received the same reviews that any outside clinic or nursing home would have. Our mortalities are reviewed by independent reviews. So I'm not sure. I mean, we get oversight. If there's a mistake made or something of that nature, we're going to look into it and do something about it. Correct the issue.
Thank you, Director. What I would ask specifically is some of the questions that may not have been answered more thoroughly. Our staff will get with you so that we can get answers in writing, and that in particular at the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn, New York. Your memory, or it may not have come to your attention, I'd want a direct response and answer on that matter. And I thank you for that. I'm also going to suggest that there is a Board of Health oversight for the Department of Prison, Federal Bureau of Prisons. I know that you do have a number of other agencies, but I think one that is specifically focused on helping the Bureau going forward will be very helpful. Let me finally submit into the record, man is 16th to die from COVID-19 at Fort Worth Prison. Cases spike at women's facility. So as I conclude, Director, let me say I'm not sure of whether or not you'll appear before this committee or a committee in the other body, but let me take this opportunity to show our appreciation from a person who has chosen as his career to serve the nation. And obviously coming into the Bureau many, many years ago, you have continued to make a commitment to serve this nation. So it is my privilege to be able to say thank you for your service. It should not go unnoticed. You've served under many administrations, Democratic and Republican, and you've chosen to commit yourself to hopefully the lives and the ultimate liberty of individuals that we hope will be restored and will enter into society and never to return again. I hope that is your vision. You've stayed, and as I thank you, I want to make sure that we thank the hardworking officers who go by the appropriate mixture of reform, accountability, and compassion. So thank you again for your testimony this morning. This concludes, and your service to the nation. This concludes today's hearing. Thank you to our distinguished witness for attending. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witness or additional materials for the record. The hearing is now adjourned. I hope that was heard. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Congresswoman.